What if someone you loved, someone who was full of life, suddenly came back, but not as the person you remembered? What if they returned, not as a miracle, but as a nightmare? This is the story of Evan Black, a young man whose life ended in tragedy, only for his death to give rise to something far more sinister. Today, we unravel the chilling tale of his return, a twisted awakening that defies the natural order of life and death. Stick around as we dive into the haunting events that followed Evan's fatal crash, the funeral, his shocking return, and the horrifying transformation that left an entire town in fear. You won't believe how this story ends. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Now let's get started. Let's start with how it all began, a life full of promise, gone too soon. Evan Black was the kind of person you couldn't help but admire. Whether he was lighting up a room with his infectious laughter or helping a friend through a rough patch, Evan seemed to embody everything good about being young and alive. At just 22, he had his entire future laid out before him. A degree nearly complete, a promising career waiting in the wings, and dreams of traveling the world with the same enthusiasm that fueled his every move. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. It was a cold January evening, the kind where frost clings stubbornly to the ground, making even the most careful drivers tread cautiously. Evan had been driving home from a late dinner with friends, the laughter and warmth of the night still fresh in his mind. The roads, however, were less forgiving. The sharp turn near Old Willow Creek was known to be treacherous, especially in winter. Locals often joked about how the road had a mind of its own, but for Evan, the danger became all too real. His car hit a patch of black ice, spinning out of control before colliding violently with a row of towering trees. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The doctors later told his family that it had been quick, a broken neck, sparing him any prolonged suffering. They spoke of him as though his death was a mercy, a quiet end to a promising life. But those words, meant to comfort, only seemed to deepen the void left behind. For his family, Evan's absence was an unbearable weight. His mother couldn't bring herself to pack away his belongings. His father spent sleepless nights staring out the window as though expecting Evan to pull into the driveway like nothing had happened. As they prepared for his funeral, their grief felt insurmountable. How do you say goodbye to someone who was supposed to be the best man at his brother's wedding? How do you bury the person you thought would someday carry your legacy forward? These were the questions they wrestled with as they chose a casket, wrote an obituary, and arranged the funeral service. But amidst the grief and heartbreak, there was an unsettling undercurrent, a faint whisper that something wasn't quite right. If only they'd known just how far from right things would become. Next, strange and creepy signs began to appear. The funeral was a quiet affair, marked by low murmurs and heavy hearts. A cloudy sky loomed overhead, as though the heavens themselves were mourning the loss of someone so full of promise. Friends and family gathered around Evan's casket, their words of sorrow blending with the gentle rustle of the wind. The preacher spoke of eternal peace, of angels welcoming Evan into the fold. But as comforting as his words were meant to be, there was a strange tension in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on the crowd. It wasn't just grief, it was something more. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Evan's mother swore she felt a cold draft run down her spine, despite the stillness of the day. For the first few days, the house was steeped in silence. But then, things began to shift. Evan's father, an early riser, noticed faint noises at dawn, soft creaks and muffled thuds, as though someone was moving around upstairs. He dismissed it as the house settling or his own exhaustion playing tricks on him. The unease grew stronger with each passing day. But the most chilling sign came when the family received a bouquet of lilies, Evan's favorite flower, delivered anonymously to their door. The card read, "Forever in our hearts." No one in the family had ordered it. While these events unsettled them, they still clung to logic, attributing them to coincidence. It wasn't until the caretaker of the local cemetery made a late-night call to Evan's father that denial became impossible. "I'm sorry to bother you," the caretaker began, his voice trembling. "But something's not right. Evan's grave, it's..." He couldn't finish his sentence, but his tone said it all. Evan's father drove to the cemetery in the dead of night, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and disbelief. When he arrived, his worst nightmare greeted him. The dirt above Evan's grave was disturbed, as though something, or someone, had clawed its way out. Underneath the embalming chemicals meant to preserve his body, something had started to stir. A twitch of a finger, a flutter of an eyelid, movements too small to notice during his burial, but now impossible to ignore. And then, Evan woke. But it wasn't the peaceful awakening of someone reborn. It was the agonizing return of something trapped between life and death. His limbs felt stiff, his thoughts clouded. His once lively heart now beat with a sluggish rhythm, as though it wasn't meant to pump blood through his veins anymore. When Evan crawled out of his grave, it wasn't freedom he found. It was a horrifying reality where he didn't belong. Imagine this happening in your own home. Could you face someone you loved, knowing they've become something unrecognizable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Beneath the oppressive weight of the earth, Evan's instincts surged, primal and unrelenting. His body, suspended in a state between life and death, refused to remain confined. The coffin, meant to protect his remains, became his prison. His first movements were feeble, a faint twitch of his fingers, a slow flex of his legs. Yet with each passing moment, his strength grew. The satin lining of the coffin was no match for his clawing hands. His nails splintered against the wood, but the pain, if it could be called that, registered as nothing more than an afterthought. The first crack in the lid sent a cascade of dirt into the coffin, filling the space with choking soil. But Evan didn't stop. With strength that defied explanation, he pushed, clawed, and tore his way through the layers of earth. The graveyard above, silent and still, bore witness to his resurrection. When Evan emerged, it was as though the world itself recoiled. The air was colder, the night eerier. He stumbled to his feet, disoriented, his body stiff and unfamiliar. The cool breeze bit at his pale, taut skin, which seemed to stretch unnaturally over his frame. His glowing eyes reflected the moonlight, casting an unearthly sheen. The world around him felt both vivid and alien. The trees loomed larger, their branches clawing at the night sky. The rustle of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures were deafening. His heightened senses, sight, smell, and sound, flooded him with an overwhelming stream of information. For a moment, he stood motionless, his mind grappling with this new reality. He looked down at his hands, dirtied and worn, his nails jagged and bloodied. The body he had once known so well was no longer his own. Something had changed him, twisted him into something unrecognizable. Evan took a tentative step forward, his movements jerky, unnatural. The graveyard behind him fell silent, as if the earth itself held its breath. The world seemed hostile, foreign, yet something deep inside him urged him forward. Finally, his family faced a nightmare they couldn't escape. Evan's body, driven by instincts beyond his comprehension, carried him home. The house stood at the edge of the street, a beacon of familiarity in a world that felt so alien. Warm light spilled from the windows, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness he felt. He pushed open the front door, the creak of its hinges echoing through the quiet home. His mother was in the living room, staring at the television. At the sound, she turned, her expression shifting from shock to a fragile hope. "Evan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a fleeting moment, she believed it was a miracle. Her son had come back to her. She rose to her feet, tears brimming in her eyes. But as Evan stepped into the light, her hope shattered. His pale, lifeless face and stiff movements extinguished any illusion of normalcy. His glowing eyes were the final, undeniable proof that this was no miracle. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, no," she stammered, backing away. Evan tried to reach out, his jerky movements betraying his intent. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His throat felt raw, his voice an unresponsive echo of what it had been. Her scream pierced the air, summoning the rest of the family. Evan's father and younger sister, Lily, rushed in, freezing when they saw him. "Evan?" His father's voice was heavy with disbelief. Lily's face paled. "What is this?" she whispered, clutching her father's arm. Evan's father stepped protectively in front of Lily, his confusion quickly giving way to fear. "Stay back," he commanded, though his voice trembled. Evan took another step forward, his movements clumsy, as though his body were no longer fully under his control. He could see the terror in their eyes, feel the widening chasm between him and the family he had once loved. For a moment, recognition flickered in his glowing eyes, a desperate plea for understanding. But the moment passed, and all that remained was the cold, haunting presence of something that should not exist. His mother sank to her knees, sobbing. "This isn't my son," she choked out, her voice filled with despair. The house, once a sanctuary of love, was now a stage for horror. The realization hit Evan like a blow. Whatever had brought him back, it had stolen the very essence of who he was. Evan Black's story is a haunting blend of tragedy, horror, and a grim reminder of the dangers of defying the natural order. Sometimes, the scariest tales aren't about death itself, but what happens when we refuse to stay dead. What do you think really happened to Evan? Was it a science experiment gone horribly wrong, a supernatural curse, or something beyond explanation? Share your theories in the comments below. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.